So welcome. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. It's entitled Extreme Climate Impacts, ensuring that COP26 delivers finance for affected communities. And as I was saying, this is part of London Climate Action Week, which will have about 100 events going on. I'm David Hillman. I'm director of the Robin Hood Tax Campaign. And probably we're best known for our work about taxing the financial sector, but have now recently launched a campaign for greater taxation of the fossil fuel industry, the Make Polluters Pay campaign, a Robin Hood tax campaign, if you will, on polluters. And that's to raise substantial finance for loss and damage. So let me just explain how the session will run. Our plan is to have about half the time for the presentations and about half the time for Q&A. And first, we're going to hear from our excellent panel of speakers. UN Special Rapporteur David Boyd's presentation will go first. Chikondi Chabruta from ActionAid next. Then Colin McQuiston from Practical Action. And the fourth speaker will be Zoe Rasbash from the UK Youth Climate Coalition. And then for the Q&A, as I was saying right at the very top of the call, if you were right in there, please write your questions in the Q&A box, stating your name, your organization, if you have one, country, and who your question is for. And we will endeavor to cover as many questions as we can within our time constraints. And then to round off, I'm going to ask the speakers to just give a quick final minute or two. Now, I should say that with David Boyd's presentation, this is pre-recorded, as UN Business has meant he will be joining us a little later. But all being well, he will be here for the entire Q&A. But before we play his presentation, let me just say a few words by way of introduction to the session itself. Loss and damage is the evidence of the climate crisis. It tells the graphic story that we have already changed our climate, that the 1% temperature rise we already have is creating impacts so great we do not have the ability to adapt to them. The increase in the intensity and frequency of disasters over the last few years is such that some say there is no such thing anymore as a natural disaster. The footprint of climate change is present in all climate disasters. And the clearest indicator of an impact beyond which we can adapt to is the displacement of people, forced migration due to our changed climate. When Earth cannot be farmed anymore because of heat, when land is swallowed up by water. And for the people forced to move, they were not responsible with their carbon footprint for the consequences. That is why this is such a question of injustice. And that is why we have to have a solidarity facility, solidarity fund for loss and damage. We need money. We need action and support for the populations affected. This is why the issue of loss and damage cannot be ignored or sidelined at COP26. Indeed, COP26 needs to be remembered for the moment when real progress on loss and damage finance finally happened. So, with that said, by way of introduction, let's hear from UN Special Rapporteur, Dr. David Boyd.
West Coast of Canada for this really important session on loss and damages at the London Climate Action Week. Climate change is actually just part of a broader global environmental crisis in which we are mired, which includes the climate emergency, of course, but also the nature crisis, the fact that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, the air pollution health crisis, which is taking 7 million causing 7 million premature deaths every year, including hundreds of thousands of children under the age of 5, and most recently, the emergence of COVID-19. The latest in a long and growing series of emerging infectious diseases of zoonotic origin, which are all of these environmental crises, climate, nature, pollution, and pandemics, all caused by our dysfunctional relationship with the natural world. And these problems are all connected, and so must their solutions. So we know that if we could stop deforestation and protect nature, that would actually contribute to addressing climate change and reducing the risk of future pandemics. If we stop burning fossil fuels, we eliminate one of the major causes of climate change and also dramatically reduce air pollution and contribute to the protection of biological diversity. So in my role as the UN Special Rapporteur, I have witnessed firsthand the terrible impacts that climate change is already having on people all across this planet. My first official mission was to Fiji, where I visited the community of Unidongoloa, one of the first communities in the world that had to be completely relocated because of climate change. It used to be a tropical oceanfront paradise, but rising sea levels, storm surges, and the saltwater contamination of their drinking water and agriculture lands led them to have to be relocated. They are the first in Fiji, but there are more than 50 other communities in that one country alone awaiting relocation. And the great injustice is that the people of Unidongoloa and the people of Fiji have had almost nothing to do with causing the global climate emergency, and yet they are at the front lines of suffering its impacts. I also visited several informal settlements in Fiji, places where people who were rendered homeless by Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016 are now living in very, very rough circumstances. Tropical Cyclone Winston, consistent with climate science, was the most intense storm to ever reach land in the southern hemisphere, winds of over 300 kilometers an hour that had devastating impacts on Fiji. And so I've also been to Norway, where I spent time north of the Arctic Circle with the Sami indigenous people, a people whose lives and culture is being disrupted by climate change. You know, these are people for whom the heart of their culture, the heart of their economy is reindeer herding. And reindeer during the winter, they use their hoofs historically to scrape away the snow to get at the mosses and lichen that sustain them. Now they get rain in Norway, north of the Arctic Circle, in the middle of winter, which freezes and creates ice, and the reindeer simply cannot scrape away the ice, leading to mass starvation. And so that's having devastating impacts on the Sami people at the other end of the planet from the people of Fiji. In Kenya, I learned about the devastating impacts of drought on farmers and livestock herders. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of impacts. So, of course, the nations of the world came together in 1992 and negotiated the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change with three key components: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Mitigation, well, we're not doing so well. Greenhouse gas emissions have actually gone up by over 60% since that treaty was negotiated. Adaptation, rich countries have never fulfilled their promises to finance adaptation in small island states and the least developed countries. But loss and damage is really the most egregious example of inaction. You know, Vanuatu put forward a proposal about loss and damage back in 1991. The Maldives put forward a similar proposal in 2008. And yet here we are in 2020, and there still has not been a single dollar that has changed hands, that has gone from wealthy countries to small island states and other least developed countries. It's an absolute injustice of the highest order. It's a violation of human rights, and we need to do something about it. As part of the UN FCCC process, the Warsaw International Mechanism was established in 2013, and I tip my hat to the people who are courageously and patiently working through that process to try and achieve some progress on loss and damages. However, it is my opinion that we need to go outside of the UN FCCC process. We need to find a champion who will support the use of some kind of innovative financial mechanism, whether it's a tax on polluters, a tax on fossil fuel extraction, whether it's an international air passenger levy or some kind of financial transaction tax. I'm fairly agnostic about which specific tool is used, but I believe we need to look at the French example of leadership involved in a few years ago when France created the solidarity levy, a tax on air travel, a small tax on local travel, a larger tax on international travel. France persuaded 9 other countries, including Chile, Cameroon, and South Korea, to join forces with them. And they have raised over $1 billion through that levy to finance work on HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria in Africa. So a simple solution, a huge contribution, and I believe that what we need now is someone to behave like France, some state or group of states to take a leadership position outside of the UNFCCC, say, we're going to do this. We're going to create some kind of financial mechanism and a fund that will be used for loss and damage for the small island states and for the least developed countries, recognizing that we have failed on mitigation, we have failed on adaptation, and even if we succeeded in those 2 areas, there would still be residual impacts that demand compensation. From a climate justice perspective, that demand compensation. From a human rights perspective, that demand compensation. And so, my friends, I hope that we can work together to find those champions and to refine those proposals so that we can raise billions of dollars in the near future, in the immediate future, to address loss and damage caused by climate change. I look forward to your questions and answers, and I thank you for the tremendous work that all of you are doing on behalf of the people we love and this beautiful planet that we are so fortunate to call home. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, we will be hearing live from David. He's going to join us about 1:30. I think we could probably lose that from the screen now, if that's all right with you, Sarah. And I'll move over to our second speaker. A few words to introduce Chikondi. Chikondi Chabuta is ActionAid's regional humanitarian advisor for Southern Africa, is based in Malawi. She supports vulnerable communities during emergency humanitarian responses, most recently Cyclone Idai, Kenneth, and the devastating food crisis hitting Southern Africa. Chikondi works to ensure that ActionAid's partners implement women-led emergency responses that protect women and girls and build communities' resilience to future disasters and crises. She has witnessed firsthand how increasingly frequent and intense climate disasters are affecting communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. Chikondi, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for according me this opportunity. I'll just start by explaining Cyclone Idai, Cyclone Kenneth. As you all know, these 2 hit parts of Southern Africa in March last year. It had devastating impacts. And up to now, over a year, close to 2 years, people are still trying to pick their lives and move on from this crisis. For example, in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, we have over 300,000 people living in destroyed and damaged, even makeshift shelters, over a year after the cyclone hit. And some communities in Malawi are still living in resettlement sites and need of assistance and protection. Cyclones are a very strange phenomenon in this part of the world, and scientific evidence has pointed out that these disasters, together with the frequent floods, the frequent droughts that we are experiencing, and now also the fall armyworm and locust infestation, are all attributed to climate change. Climate change has really brought devastation, and it is pushing back the progress that is being made in countries within the region. Any effort to develop is being destroyed and pushed back by these climatic impacts that these countries had little to play for them to be there. So honestly, even the humanitarian system is stressed right now because of several climatic shocks that are affecting vulnerable communities and the need to respond. As we continue sharing about the impacts of climate change and the cry from the global south about the devastating impacts, and to support the efforts on the adaptation, damage has already been done and will continue to be done, and we are forced to live with it. We are living with the impacts. There is a lot of talk about climate emergency, but poor people in the global south are living the consequences of choices that the rich countries are making. People are continually losing their lives. Cyclone Idai was that example because it claimed 1,000 lives, whilst the preceding droughts and floods, and even now the hunger crisis that we are faced because of the droughts, they're taking away the dignity and the lives of women, children, and young people's hopes every single day. There have been many global conferences, and we have had over 2 decades of discussing and debating climate change in COP amongst other platforms on financing, but no robust financial mechanism on supporting developing countries to recover from the loss and damage is in place. The development that is seen in rich countries has had far-reaching consequences on the countries in Southern Africa and the global South in general, and it is time that change must take place. However, the real cost of climate change is much higher and should include the residual damage that is likely to remain even after mitigation and adaptation. Loss and damage should be included in decisions about how developing countries will be compensated for the impacts of climate change, and I'm glad David Boyd has also mentioned on it. How many more lives should be lost? How much damage should be seen to make the changes? It is time that we are preparing, and as we are preparing and are part of the London Climate Week, rich countries must make these commitments. They must make deeper emission cuts as their fair share and adopt green technologies and energy systems. The rich countries must also provide finance and technology to developing countries to enable them to adopt greener pathways and adapt effectively to climate change while continuing to take millions out of poverty. And another ask to rich countries would be to compensate those people who cannot adapt to climate change because the impacts are so severe so that we can recover from these climatic disasters. At the London Climate Week, as ActionAid, we are calling on the UNFCCC negotiations and the climate advocates to, 1, give loss and damage the attention it deserves. Climate policy makers, both within negotiations and outside, including academics, civil society, business people, they should support and advocate for a comprehensive approach to the issue of loss and damage. Number 2 is to recognize that finance for loss and damage is needed and should be considered separately to adaptation. Finance for loss and damage should be calculated separately from adaptation finance and not further deplete an already small pot for adaptation actions. Society advocates should include demands for a robust and permanent financial mechanism under the UN for loss and damage in their campaigns on climate finance, alongside demands for adaptation and mitigation finance. We are also saying that we need to support calls for country-specific information on loss and damage. Governments need to recognize that there is an enormous lack of information on loss and damage, particularly in the developing countries, and must endorse a UN coordinated information mechanism responsible for dealing with this, such as the risk management component in the Small Island States proposal to address loss and damage. I will not emphasize much on the Small Island States, as David Boyd had mentioned on it at length in his speech. And lastly, we're saying that we need to ensure that any loss and damage mechanism priorities are there to prioritize the poorest and most vulnerable people. As the current Small Island States is still in development, there is an opportunity to ensure it recognizes the poorest and most vulnerable households. Particularly here, we're talking about women and young people. They must be involved as eco-stakeholders in accessing finance and implementing solutions to protect their rights and dignity. So these are some of the asks that we would want to see together with fellow climate advocates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chikondi. I'm going to move straight on to Colin. Colin McQuiston is the head of climate and resilience at Practical Action and has 30 years experience in international development. He is particularly interested in systems approaches and the challenge of climate change. Colin has been following the climate negotiations since COP20 and is a regular observer of the work of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you, David. And yes, it's good to be here. I hope everybody can see my screen. My slide. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm Colin McQuiston. I'm the head of climate and resilience at Practical Action. Practical Action is an NGO that was set up in 1966 by the alternative economist Fritz Schumacher, the person who wrote the book Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. And I think it's really important, some of the messages that he brought around in the 1960s are really, I think, resonant with us today around the role of fossil fuels, around the role of pollution, around who pays for the impacts and who suffers the consequences. Okay, so I've been following the climate change negotiations since 2014, and I was very early in the process introduced to this idea around loss and damage, and the fact that for many of the people around the world, for many communities, climate change is already leading to irreversible impacts. And this is a slide that the UNFCCC has developed, which really documents the scope of loss and damage. And what you see here is that loss and damage is manifest both in terms of rapid events such as floods or heat waves, but it's also these slow onset events such as drought, such as sea level rise, which are having a huge impact around the world. And as David Boyd has already mentioned, irreversible climate impact are being recognized in Fiji, forcing climate displacement, climate people displacement, and in Norway, where reindeer herders are having trouble feeding their herds throughout the year. It's important, I think, to realize that these irreversible impacts have both a direct economic component. There is a financial cost that we can quite easily calculate as a result of lost crops or as a result of areas flooded and rivers and bridges, bridges damaged by river flooding. But equally, there's the non-economic losses that occur as well. There is the human lives that can be lost as a result of some of these events. There's the increase in mortality due to heat waves. There's also the loss of biodiversity and the irreversible impact on ecosystems that underpin many of our economies around the world. As David Boyd mentioned, this was first introduced into the climate change negotiations by Vanuatu back in 1991. But sadly, although I think climate change and the impacts of climate change have been long recognized, it took another decade before loss and damage was finally introduced into the lexicon of the negotiators. And finally, it was introduced into the COP statement at COP in Bali back in 2007. Since then, there's been other milestones. The work program on loss and damage was established in Cancun in 2010. And finally, in 2013, linked to Cyclone Haiyan and the impact it was having in the Philippines, the Warsaw International Mechanism to address loss and damage was finally established at COP19 in Warsaw. And that negotiating process has continued through to the inclusion of loss and damage as one of the fundamental articles of the Paris Agreement. As we've already heard, one of the 3 pillars of the agreement alongside mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. But since 2015 or since 2013, there have been a lot of meetings, there's been a lot of talk about loss and damage, but sadly, there hasn't been an awful lot of action. One of the areas where there has been some action is around insurance. We recognize that when these extreme events are taking place, we can see that there's a clear climate signal to many of these events. And one of the ideas that has been put forward to try and respond to this is the idea of insurance. And there has been a number of donors providing sovereign premium payments for regional risk insurance pools, trying to get adoption of insurance more widely. But sadly, insurance isn't a solution that can easily be rolled out. It isn't a solution that most poor people can afford. We're talking about insurance in countries where health insurance and vehicle insurance uptake is already quite low. And we have to really bear in mind the justice dimensions that underpins insurance is not the total solution to the challenge of loss and damage. And here is the example from Hurricane Maria in Dominica in 2017, which struck the Caribbean. And as you can see from this assessment of the damages and the investment of the payments that were received, less than a quarter of the total impact of that hurricane on the nation of Dominica was actually paid for by insurance, by grants, by loans from global donors and multilateral organizations, leaving a remainder of over $1 billion for the people, the country of Dominica, to have to repay, to compensate for the losses that they faced. It wasn't only Dominica that was struck. Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and several other countries in the Caribbean were impacted in a very similar way. And we know that these disasters, Typhoon Haiyan, I've already mentioned, Cyclone Amphan in Bangladesh this year, Cyclone Idai, Cyclone Kenneth. These disasters, these climate exacerbated disasters, are increasing, and they're having an increasing impact around the world, but particularly on communities and people who are least responsible. So I'd just like to finally bring us to the London Climate Action Week and focus on the potential of the role of London. And I think I've been inspired by some of the things that David Boyd mentioned at the introduction around the potential of leadership and the potential of the role of the City of London, perhaps as a leader to spur on a change that fulfills the promises of the international community and actually starts to deliver some of the assistance that the countries on the front line of climate change really need. I think it's really important to bear in mind this ActionAid report from 2016 on the drought in Malawi, where the government of Malawi had actually invested in a regional risk insurance program. They had declared an emergency in April of that year, but sadly, the design of the product didn't meet the actual parameters of that drought event. And the insurance pool initially was unwilling to pay the premium, even though people were suffering on the ground. That emergency was declared in April. Finally, the insurer, the Africa Risk Capacity, finally accepted that the drought had the bad impact and they needed to pay out. Those payouts didn't occur until November. So many more lives were lost, many more people suffered because insurance just isn't the right modality to meet the needs of people in loss and damage. The insurance industry in the City of London is huge. It has a 60 billion plus annual premium turnover. It employs a lot of people and it generates a lot of GDP. But is this potentially the driver for a resetting of the global system? Could the City of London be a leader for climate justice? Because if it isn't, then what we're doing is we're placing the financial burden on the people who are least responsible for the problem in the first place and have the least financial resources to pay for it. Other challenges, we're passing this to the next generation and passing the buck line and expecting our children and their children to foot the bill for inaction on climate change. So thank you very much for this opportunity to provide an introduction to my experiences of following the loss and damage under the climate negotiations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin. really useful, and we will no doubt be coming back to that and the role of the Warsaw International Mechanism in the Q&A. I will now move to our fourth speaker, to Zoe Rasbash, who's a system change activist with the UK Youth Climate Coalition, UKYCC, and the Loss and Damage Younger Working Group. She previously held the position of youth representative to the UN Task Force on Climate Displacement and is currently researching at the intersection of art and climate justice. Welcome, Zoe.
Thanks, David. Thanks for managing to get out UKYCC, even for us who do lots of acronyms. That's quite an annoying one. Thank you to the other speakers, Chikondi. That was particularly moving and motivating on why this subject matter is so important. So my name's Zoe, and I've been part of an international group of young people who've been campaigning on loss and damage in the international climate negotiations. And I just wanted to start with a container that I'm not an expert on loss and damage. And most often, neither are the young people that I campaign with. We're just youth climate activists concerned about what is happening and the lack of action to counter it. I went to COP26 with UKYCC to represent UK youth, quite wide-eyed and hopeful, and left quite shocked and disillusioned, having both learnt what loss and damage is and how global North governments are failing to act on it in the space of a week. So for young people, the failure, the slow pace, and the blockages from the international community to properly address loss and damage is a major frustration, to kind of almost downplay it. Not only are our generations, specifically those living in the global south, going to bear and are bearing the unavoidable impacts of climate change as a product of government inaction, we also have extremely limited avenues to participate in the decision-making around loss and damage and climate decision-making more broadly. Young people are demanding an end to inaction on loss and damage, with those of us in the global south already bearing the brunt of it, with the most limited resources to recover. And our children will face disasters at a scale we've never seen before. And this is like both a terrifying and mobilizing, but mostly terrifying concept. And we've seen, you know, the build-up of the youth movement, the influence it's had, and how the youth climate movement have really rallied around the cry from frontline indigenous and grassroots groups. We're not demanding, well, we are demanding climate action, but we're demanding climate justice. We're advocating for climate reparations and a climate action which acknowledges how the global historical pattern of development has left half the world rich and relatively protected from climate impacts, or at least able to recover, and the other half vulnerable at their expense. Finance for loss and damage and money to protect our frontline communities from polluting nations is an actionable way to begin achieving this within the UNFCCC and climate policy. Policymakers and UNFCCC representatives continue to praise the youth movement, the energy, the dedication. They take photos with climate strikers, but they continually refuse to take up our demands. For the international community to claim they're seeking climate justice, and particularly for governments to claim they're acting in the interest of their young people, they must secure funding for loss and damage for those most impacted by the devastating effects of climate change. The polluters must pay for the damages they have caused and will cause. And if COP26 is unable to establish finance for the unavoidable effects of climate change for those who need it, then what is its purpose? Then the international community will have failed. As I've said, young people have been active and advocating on this for a while. And I've watched for a few years now from the sidelines while my government has blocked and delayed action, and kind of tired of this performative climate action from our policymakers and our governments. The Loss and Damage Youth Alliance was established in this October to demonstrate to the international community that this is an issue that young people see of as utmost importance. We are trying to take action because we do not want to be further victims of apathy and inaction demonstrated by today's decision makers, especially now COVID-19 has shown us how quickly and boldly governments can take action in crisis. And it's time to do the same for loss and damage. This alliance is working to hold the broken system accountable, not only for our generation, but for the generations to come. And our members are young climate activists from all over the world who are demanding an end to the superficial and tokenistic engagement of youth in climate decision-making. And we're trying to help create a better informed generation where the community has advanced knowledge on loss and damage and its interaction with development. As Chikondi mentioned, information around loss and damage is really hard to access and not mentioned in the classroom like adaptation and mitigation is. You shouldn't have to go to a COP to know what loss and damage is. And if you want to hear more about the action that the Loss and Damage Youth Alliance are doing, there will be a webinar on Friday, the 20th, which is going to be dedicated to the youth experiences, perspectives and actions on loss and damage, which I would recommend everyone attend. So as I said before, loss and damage needs to be the metric of success or failure at COP26. The Paris Agreement promises to strengthen the UNFCCC Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And for years, rich governments have delayed strengthening the third arm of the WIM dedicated to support and resources. By not providing finance for loss and damage at COP26, the international community are ignoring what is mandated under the Paris Agreement, but also ignoring the voices of young people globally and the global demands for climate justice. And we really need leadership from global North governments, particularly the COP26 presidency. Due to the implicit power imbalances in the Paris Agreement, global North governments must take a lead now, and the Loss and Damage Youth Alliance have penned an open letter to the COP26 presidency to force the UK to step up its leadership alongside other global North governments. And due to the UK's enormous historical responsibility for climate change and historical inaction on loss and damage finance, they need to take this opportunity to be the climate leaders that they claim to be. And we have a few demands which are quite similar to ActionAid's. We demand that they take political leadership to make loss and damage a priority by making loss and damage a permanent agenda item in the climate negotiations so that countries are aware it's a political priority. Commit to establishing a new window of finance for loss and damage. COP26 is the moment to make polluters pay for the damage they have caused. The UK government must open up this window by announcing a pledge of new and additional sources of finance to address loss and damage. It should include a minimum level of support beyond the $100 billion from public sources and should explore innovative sources of finance, such as a global tax on fossil fuel extraction. And lastly, ensure fair and inclusive participation in loss and damage decision making. For us, meaningful inclusion isn't just side events or the photo opportunities. It means decision makers actually including us in policy making processes, and fair decision making on loss and damage must also be guided by the experiences and needs of frontline communities. So we're demanding that youth and frontline communities set the agenda on loss and damage going forward. And lastly, I just want to say that finance for loss and damage is absolutely necessary and must be established at COP26, but the fight doesn't stop there. More needs to be done. We also need to continue to fight for a more appropriate and progressive response to loss and damage. And from a young person's perspective, we need a more comprehensive understanding and associated action on how to address non-economic losses and damages specifically, as Colin discussed earlier. Currently, young people experience non-material, non-economic losses from climate change at a higher rate. As these non-economic losses are not, as these losses are not traded within markets, they remain neglected within the climate negotiations. And in general, global North countries are more likely to experience economic loss and damages, with global South experiencing higher rates of non-economic losses and damages. And by skewing the conversation to only economic losses, it again works to erase the devastating consequences of those most impacted. Young people are really likely to be impacted by these non-economic losses. For example, we're more likely to live in informal settlements, be in informal housing, work in the informal economy, and therefore be more vulnerable to the unquantifiable impacts of climate change. Just to highlight a study that was done on the effects of flooding on informal settlements in Cape Town, it showed that young residents face a myriad of difficulties due to lack of infrastructure, which limits their adaptive capacity and makes them really vulnerable to non-economic losses, experiencing psychological impacts like mental health issues, anxiety due to difficult conditions and lack of independence. Many of the young people areas are forced to move to are illegal settlements and lie outside government protection and are unable to get adaptation or development funding, and force young people to live beyond the limits of adaptation. A decrease in access to sanitation facilities affects both the dignity and health of young people, alongside the myriad of social impacts, including reducing community cohesion, a lack of capacity to support one another, and exaggerating existing socio-political tensions. And also young people within these settlements are excluded from decision-making processes. So we must establish finance to protect these communities at COP26, but we also need to continue pushing for a more progressive definition and understanding of loss and damage to ensure we're addressing the experience of those most vulnerable, especially vulnerable young people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe. There was so much in what you said, and a very strong challenge in there that the successful failure of COP26 needs to be judged by the metric of finance for loss and damage. And on that, can I ask and encourage people to put questions into the chat so that we can do that? Can I also ask colleagues Sarah and Ruth to be looking out for David Boyd, who will be appearing and then will need to be accorded speaker rights. And then let me start the question. So to the panel in general, from Sarah Stillwell. David Boyd spoke about the need for collaboration between states to take action on loss and damage funding. How and when could this start to happen? I wonder maybe I could turn to Colin first on that one.
Well, I guess there's two dimensions that would be worth exploring. The first one is the lesson learned from Southern Africa in 2019 with Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth was they didn't impact within a geography, they impacted across a region. And there were communities on either side of the river, which happened to be in two separate countries, who were equally impacted by the impact of that cyclone. And I think in the response and in the immediate aftermath of some of these climate exacerbated events, it's going to be really beneficial if countries can forget about those geographic borders and actually help the people who are impacted by those events. I think the second dimension to that will then be that will probably drive a degree of displacement. And that's something that I think those countries would want to have an oversight of, but I think needs to be accepted that maybe is part and parcel of the fundamental changes which are taking place, that areas within that geography are no longer habitable and people are being forced to move. And the nearest place might be in a neighboring country. So I think there's the issue around the immediate aftermath of the response where regional collaboration is going to be advisable and needs to be promoted. And I think we already see that within the disaster risk management community, this idea of promoting regional collaboration when these events take place. I think the second area is probably an area that I touched on, and that's around sovereign risk pooling. If a number of countries together are facing a climate event and they are to share their resources, financial resources as well as other resources, then of course the response, the ability to adapt is going to be greater. I think the important thing is that in both of those cases that I've highlighted, they're very much sticking plasters. They're not changing the fundamental system. They're not addressing many of the underlying vulnerabilities to which these poor communities are dependent. But I think there is definitely a need for regional collaboration, and we could move forward if countries could be facilitated to engage. And there is a mechanism within the Water International Mechanism that was agreed at COP25 in Madrid to set up this idea of a Santiago network, a network to help countries better coordinate and better respond. But that is very much a response mechanism, and it's not a climate justice mechanism, and it's not going to be removing or addressing the underlying problems. And I'm going to have to stop there, David. Thank you.
Chikondi, did you want to comment on that question?
Yes, so I think it's important to remember that we're talking about people's lives, and it's about people. You know, when we are talking of the different jargon that is experienced in the negotiations, etc., we need to remember that behind that there are people whose lives are being destabilized every day because of the climate impacts. So we need to have a human face to loss and damage. We need to have a human face put forward to really have the rich countries come forth and respond and provide the finance that is separate from adaptation finance. So if you ask me, when would this happen? It has to be as soon as yesterday, because people's lives are being destabilized every single day. So that would be my response, David. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And Zoe, did you have a comment to that question?
I mean, as I kind of phrase, I'm not an expert specifically, on opportunities at the kind of international level, but I think, governments can always learn from the collaboration that's happening on the ground. I mean, we've seen so much amazing international solidarity in response to the climate movement. So you kind of just look and follow your citizens. I doubt they'll do it, but there's always a good example there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to this question in the chat. Do please keep questions coming, but very happy to take this question from Christopher, who's from Vanuatu. Vanuatu is extremely concerned by the lackluster language chosen by the UK for COP26, hiding loss and damage under a theme of adaptation resilience, and even the politically correct phrase of residual climate risks and unavoidable climate impacts. These phrases undermine the critical urgency of mobilizing finance to address the loss of life, livelihoods, culture, and widespread trauma by people from developing and of course developed countries. Vanuatu sounding the alarm since 1991. Now 2020 still not being recognized adequately or practically in global negotiation forums. What can be done now to mobilize real action in the lead up to COP26? Thank you for that question, Christopher. And I think this mobilization does speak to some of the things, Zoe, that you were talking about. And a number of people involved in this work realize that much greater awareness of loss and damage is necessary. That loss and damage, as I said in my introduction, is actually the story of the climate crisis that we are in. And so any thoughts about how we can create greater awareness and therefore create greater noise that can accompany this run up to COP26, which can therefore put pressure on policymakers that they actually have to come up with some actual action on loss and damage finance. Over to you, Zoe.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I think there's several problems that we face in regards to this. So first of all is that we've seen the impact that, you know, massive climate mobilizations can have, but we're obviously limited in that now because of COVID. And the second, I think, is this issue of kind of what you spoke about in your question of like adaptation, resilience, and all of people on the ground and people who aren't even experiencing climate change know what the impacts of climate change look like, and they're worried about it, but they're not putting it into the terms of loss and damage or adaptation resilience or limits to adaptation. And I think it's in those who are aware of it and those who are engaged, it's our responsibility to start making those links and being like, let's kind of de-jargonize the term loss and damage so that we can kind of make the links that this is something that everybody is, this is their primary concern when it comes to climate change. You know, this is the apocalyptic impacts that we're all terrified of. So I think that on kind of like a messaging level. And I think in regards to building a momentum and kind of putting pressure on policymakers, just to spotlight the work that the COP26 coalition are doing, which is a coalition of hundreds of civil society organizations who this week have been putting on their Ground Up Festival, which is hundreds of events. And I know that for them, and this coalition, who are going to be extremely active on the run up to COP26, whether that is on the streets or if we can't be on the streets, then online, I imagine, are really spotlighting loss and damage as an issue and really starting to make these connections between, you know, how we imagine climate change and what loss and damage actually is. So that's kind of the two things I would say.
Great, thank you very much for that. It's really helpful. But on the same question, I think I'll go back down the line. Chikondi, do you have a response to Christopher's question from Vanuatu?
Great, thank you. So I think we do relate with Vanuatu in terms of the experiences that they are bringing in, and also now that loss and damage is now being hidden within adaptation. I've explicitly said before that adaptation finance is already a small pot. And what we are saying is it's a loss and damage pot. Because what is happening is, I'll give you an example. The cyclone Idai, when it was hitting, just the previous year, the communities were faced with flooding and there was a drought. And then there was the fall armyworm. Now, everyone is trying to respond and support those disasters, and then Cyclone Idai hits. As we're responding to Cyclone Idai, there is more flooding and there is more drought. So you see that the humanitarian system itself is very much constrained. It's too stressed because of this, trying to tap from the same pot as adaptation. So it is true, we need to have that separate pot, and we need to have loss and damage now, because the impacts of climate change are increasing in intensity, and we need the action now. We need the finance for that pot now, and the recognition of loss and damage now. So that would be my response, David. Thank you.
Thank you. And Colin, did you have a response to the question from Vanuatu?
I mean, it really is important. I think it was Zoe who mentioned that the terminology of loss and damage is something that we shouldn't need to explain to people. It's something that should, when you say it to somebody, they go, oh yeah, loss and damage, it's the existential threat of the consequences of failing to act on climate change. And I think this drumbeat that we need to generate around, if we're really serious to deliver the climate negotiations, we're talking COP26. The 26 means it's the 26th year of the global community coming together, supported by the best research, the best scientists, to talk about climate change. And we need to stop that. We need to stop meeting and talking. We need to start acting. So I think there is really a need to sensitize people to the idea of loss and damage. We know that there is a global movement to try and come up with better indicators for the progress of the negotiations. We have a really good indicator for mitigation, greenhouse gas emissions reduced, and you can measure that globally in terms of CO2 part per million or whatever other indicators that you choose to use. But we have a really good indicator for action on mitigation. But what we're struggling with is we don't have an indicator for adaptation, and we don't have an indicator for loss and damage. But I think we do have a comprehensive indicator for action, which is action to address and reduce loss and damage. Use that as an indicator for progress on the negotiations, because as loss and damage is increasing, and there's an excellent United Nations disaster risk reduction report been produced this year, which has looked at the last 2 decades and how the number of events has increased compared to the previous 2 decades. There was a very good report by the World Meteorological Organization on the increases in climate exacerbated events around the world. So we're definitely getting a clear signal in terms of the increase of these events and the increasing loss and damage as a result of them. What we're not seeing is the action and the commitment necessary to address those. And that to me would be an excellent indicator for the COP to adopt, to indicate progress of the negotiations. It's not the number of meetings that have been held. It's not the number of people who have attended those meetings. It's not the number of technical reports. It has to be whether those meetings, those technical reports are making a difference for the people on the front lines of climate change. And I think the final thing is, yes, adaptation and resilience, it has a really attractive way of being articulated. I can see why decision makers and politicians can go, oh, we're building resilience, so we're really helping people. Well, no, let's call a spade a spade. Address loss and damage, because at the end, at the end of the day, that is the payment for climate impacts. That's what results as a result of inaction on climate change. And I just think we need to be blatant and talk about loss and damage. We need to recognize it as the third pillar of the agreement, and let's have it set up as an indicator of progress of the global negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Colin, and really full answer. I'm going to move to this question from Charles Fraser, which is, do you think the re-entry of the US to the Paris Agreement will change the dialogue and action on loss and damage up to and during COP26? Is there a way to utilize this change from Trump to Biden? I'll start with you, Colin. I'm sorry to chuck you at the deep end, but why don't we go back down the line? And please, David, he should be joining any moment.
I mean, I guess the key is it couldn't get worse. Although, having been somebody who's lived through a number of US presidents, I have believed that they couldn't get worse for a long time, and I've been continually proven wrong. So, I mean, I think Biden gives us a window of opportunity. He said he'll bring the US back into the Paris Agreement. It's one of his first things that he will do. And he's also highlighted, I think, it as one of the 3 priorities in one of the speeches after the result was made clear. So I think he's going to bring the US back to the table and hopefully to engage in a more proactive way. They certainly have the resources to finance the process. They can support not just the various climate funds, they can also support the Secretariat and give the negotiations more capacity to deliver what is needed to move us from talk to action. But I guess we're waiting to see, really. But I think overall it has to be better than what we've had for the last 4 years. And hopefully it gives us a bit more proactive discussion in the negotiations and not just clamping down and stopping discussions, which I think has been a facet of the negotiations since Marrakesh, when it was announced that Donald Trump had won the US election. So yes, some green shoots, but I'm not expecting it to be a major shift, certainly not at the beginning of his 4-year term.
Thanks for that. Let me nuance the question over to Zoe, which is that yes, there'll be a change of leadership. This is clearly a completely different political character. But coming back to the kind of need to build noise outside, I think with the subsidence of hopefully of COVID during next year and the re-emergence of the climate emergency as probably as the most important emergency of this decade, do you see and do you have links through youth movements in the United States so that we can also be building awareness with the Biden administration on the need for loss and damage finance?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I just to reflect on kind of on the Biden question. I mean, I'm going to kind of echo Colin's lukewarm statement, where it's like America has not ever been, flying the flag for loss and damage or kind of climate justice at that kind of political level. So I think it would be a waste of time to bank all our hopes on US rejoining the Paris Agreement and everything's fine and dandy. Like, I think we've got a slight change of temperature in the room, but we still need to act as if it's still Trump at the helm, because America has always been kind of bringing these blocks into progressive action, progressive international action. And so I think, yeah, the call to mobilize and to push is just as needed. And the youth movement in the US, particularly the youth movement who are present in the COP spaces, Sustain Us, are incredibly active, strong. They have last COP they had a delegation of entirely indigenous youth. So they're really progressive and trying to platform the issues of those in the global South and those who are indigenous. And that is obviously one of those is loss and damage. So I think we can really look to the US civil society for kind of leadership here on how to kind of tackle a maybe quite slow administration, and yeah, just keep building those solidarity links across the world. But yeah, I feel no change towards how the US will be.
Let me just add to what Colin and Zoe have shared. I agree with what they're sharing right now. And, right now is the time that the US must show its commitment. We've never had that commitment. So we need them to have that commitment by providing finance for adaptation and addressing loss and damage. We're tired of lip service. They can't just keep talking without meeting their global commitments as their fair share. So they need to move from talking to acting on both reducing emissions back home and also providing finance for developing countries. They really need to honor their fair share. So yeah, let's hope that will be the way forward now with the new administration.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to move on to the UK territory just for a little bit. We've got a question from Hope. saying that the Green Party is explicit in their commitment to loss and damage, but do we know where Labour is with this? Do we know where the Conservatives are in relation to their manifesto in terms of loss and damage or climate reparations? Is there? We may not have to spend too much time on this, but let me go to Zoe first, and then and see.
I can't say that I know 100%, but I would say I would doubt very highly the Conservatives have an explicit mention of loss and damage within their manifestos. And I'm unsure about where Labour is now, but I do know that the motion passed for Labour for a Green New Deal passed at Labour conference last year. It was an internationalist Green New Deal, which prioritised things like climate reparations and outward-looking climate policy. And so I think we can kind of look to them on leadership in regards to the Labour Party and trying to push for some really progressive finance. And this obviously could be a lever of change again when thinking about COP26 presidency. So this is all important stuff to consider.
Thank you. Colin, did you have any comment on that? I noticed that David Boyd has joined. I just want to check that he has speaking rights. Colin, over to you.
No, sorry, David, I don't have anything to add. We don't engage in UK political activities. I mean, it's welcome that the Green Party has adopted this. I would hope that other political parties at least consider it, but no, I don't have any insight into this.
Okay, so can we see whether we can hear from David? David, are you with us?
Hi, folks. Sorry to be so late. Just exited another meeting, so hope things are going well. And I'll just kind of, why don't I just sit back and listen for a bit so that I get the tenor of the meeting, and then I'll jump in.
Okay, but because the meeting, listen, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It's really wonderful. You can make some time, and thank you very much for your presentation, the recorded presentation. It was excellent. I am going to abuse my position of a chair and throw you in a little bit at the deep end. Sure. We did just have a question that I gave to the panelists, which was to do with the re-entry of the US to the Paris Agreement with the Biden presidency coming. And I just wondered whether you, what your thinking is about this, and if you think this could herald some sort of change in the area of support for loss and damage.
Well, I mean, it's certainly it will be a positive development in terms of the broader climate change agenda. Whether the United States will have any appetite on the loss and damage front, I think is very much an unresolved question. I don't know that, I'm not aware of any statements that Biden has made on that specific issue to date. So I don't really have any insights there.
And basically, and please feel free to add questions to the chat at this stage. I want to draw you out on the end of your presentation, where you spoke about the need for compensation for loss and damage. This is an area which is often quite controversial in terms of language for the UNFCCC process, but it really is what we are talking about. And I wondered if you could comment any further on that, and what should happen from a human rights perspective in terms of the people who are being affected most by climate change, who are not responsible for the climate change that has happened to them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I choose my words very carefully, and I know that the compensation, the use of the word compensation raises a lot of eyebrows, raises red flags in a number of countries. And that's why in my brief introductory comments, I said, look, this is going to be a very difficult road to move forward on in the context of those formal UNFCCC negotiations, conversations happening under the umbrella of the Warsaw International Mechanism, because there are some states that are just adamantly opposed to that type of framing of the issue. But from a human rights perspective, there's absolutely no doubt. I mean, you've got a situation here where people's lives are being destroyed by climate change, and it's of no fault of their own. So from a justice perspective, it's absolutely imperative that we find solutions to this problem. And, you know, I think it was Albert Einstein who warned of, you know, taking the definition of insanity to be doing the same thing over and over again. It's fairly apparent to me that those conversations in the formal process are unlikely to produce the kinds of mechanisms in the short term that we need to compensate people for the loss and damage that has already occurred and is continuing to occur every single day. And so that's why I'm encouraging people to think of creative and innovative solutions outside of that process. And I think that's where there are actually reasons for optimism. You know, that French initiative, the Solidarity Levy, that just took one country to champion it and to bring other countries on board. Surely to God, in this day and age, at this stage of the climate emergency, we can find a handful of countries willing to champion some form of innovative financial mechanism that can then be used, that can be implemented immediately, that can have other nations pressured and kind of cajoled to come on board and start the flow of money as soon as humanly possible. Because, you know, as I said, I've seen, and probably all of you have seen this firsthand as well, but people are suffering terribly because of climate change, and we need to do something immediately to respond to those crying human needs.
Thank you very much for that, David. In fact, we know a lot about these aviation levies that fund UNITAID, and I don't mean this as a pun, but the aviation levies were really a pilot to show that you could tax globalized activity of some sort, whether it's aviation, finance, fossil fuel extraction, and redistribute that money. You could create a solidarity fund. And in the case of the aviation levies in UNITAID, it goes to HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria treatments. So really the concept is entirely proven. It takes a small group of countries, or even one country, as you mentioned, France, to take the lead to start such an initiative. And of course, we have looked back and we have precedent in the past. The Global Fund to fight HIV/AIDS is a very strong example of an international solidarity fund, which has made an enormous amount of difference. But let me draw you to this question. I'm sorry if we're going to, we had a lot of questions, obviously, to the other panelists, but we have questions directed for you, and I just want to ask you this one from Seb from Ciel. He says, David did an amazing job at addressing the linkages between climate change and human rights. I would be interested to hear from him if he sees opportunities to use UN human rights mechanisms to hold northern governments accountable for the lack of financial support for loss and damage.
Yeah, so that's a great question from Seb, and I see there's a similar question from Harjeet in the chat as well. And I think there are opportunities. I think that, you know, the various mechanisms that are available, whether they are using the communication process with the special rapporteurs, whether it's using the petition process with the various UN treaty bodies, I think those are possibilities for raising this. And I think there's also, you know, we need to get some creative lawyers to turn their minds to this as well. There have been efforts. I mean, people are probably familiar with the case that a Peruvian farmer brought against a German utility company. I think that there should be additional efforts in that field to try and bring these kinds of cases forward, but also just using the UN mechanisms, like the communications mechanism that I have access to as a special rapporteur. It doesn't have any teeth to it, but it can be used as a pressure tactic. And I guess that's where these UN mechanisms would have some utility as part of a broader civil society campaign that's trying to pressure governments to come on board with this idea addressing loss and damage in a meaningful way in the short term.
Great, thank you very much. I'm now going to open up. I'm going to ask the next question. I'm going to open up to the full panel. I've got a question here from Erin Roberts. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that we can address big challenges, mobilize resources quickly, and that ultimately have an innate capacity to take care of one another. How can we take this forward to revive global solidarity in a post-COVID-19 world to ensure that the most vulnerable countries, communities, and people have the support they need to address loss and damage in the long term? How can we harness the lessons of the response the response from the pandemic to address loss and damage? And I'll open that up, and maybe I'll start that one with Colin, and then move it across the panel.
Okay, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that we forgot to talk about was the fact that, you know, COVID-19 response and stimulus packages are going to be an opportunity to mainstream climate action. There's probably already around the world governments that have got plans in place for nature-based solutions, for mitigation, for shifting from fossil fuels to green energy, for improving housing stock, improving transport systems. There are probably a lot of potential stimulus type packages which could have really good climate outcomes. I don't think they would be directly relatable to loss and damage, but I think, you know, progress on the bigger conundrum of climate change is something that we mustn't lose sight of as we focus our attention on loss and damage. So I think COVID-19 is a game changer. I think the concern that I have is when you start to look at the plans of a lot of governments, the stimulus packages, their recovery plans, there's an awful lot of business as usual creeping into those plans. And so this potential for this sort of system change is maybe under threat. So I think there's a real need to keep governments to think about the COVID-19 pandemic, the response to that, and the lessons that we've learned about how you can have these big systemic changes to how societies operate and function, and really use them as a positive lever for successful outcomes. In regards to specifically around loss and damage, then I think the areas where I think we would need to be thinking is around highlighting the existential threat. COVID-19 was a global pandemic, a global threat to humanity. Climate change is a global threat, an existential threat, and it hasn't gone away. So we need to transfer, I think, if some of those positive lessons around responding to pandemics and being well prepared, and shift some of that towards the loss and damage argument. I think the other thing is the fact that society can make these big changes. And it's not only the COVID-19, we've also, of course, recently had Black Lives Matter, and I think an appreciation of people in more menial tasks within society, which I think, again, are all big opportunities. But I can't, off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything that's directly related to loss and damage, but I think that social solidarity and that new way of doing things maybe might unlock potential. And I'll stop there, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. And Chikondi, what's your thoughts about the lessons learned from COVID and the COVID response in relation to ambition that we could translate into this sphere?
Yeah, so I would add to what Colin has shared in a sense that we have seen political will in COVID response, and we need that same political will when responding to the climate crisis. When there is that political will and drive, things happen. We have seen that money is there. There is money available as long as people are aware of the consequences of such a devastating pandemic and of such devastating climate change impacts. So money is there, political will is there. Let's leverage and use that to also work for loss and damage and for enhancing adaptation, but also making sure loss and damage is on the table, on the agenda, just as we learned from COVID-19. Thanks, David.
Great, thank you. And Zoe, on this one?
I haven't got too much to add from what has just been said. But I would say, yeah, to kind of emphasize what Colin was saying, this new social solidarity, this looking to the grassroots of where we've really seen these support networks come out, looking to grassroots leadership, I think is something that we can take. And I also think that in a, you know, COVID, we have seen the social solidarity, but actually on the international level, we've seen a lot of turning inward from policymakers, a lot of like very national focus and less of that international focus. And I think actually climate and being the, you know, the engagement of the UNFCCC, this huge international piece of legislation that we're all kind of invested in, can actually bring us back together again. I think there's a role of climate and the UNFCCC and this in kind of healing some of those divides and getting us thinking more internationally.
Thank you. And David, your thoughts on the response to the pandemic and the ambition that follows from that, or could follow from that?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say that I agree with what Chikondi and Zoe and Colin have said in terms of shifting the debate and you know the amount of money that governments were able to come up with to address COVID-19 is quite remarkable. I think there's a danger as well that governments, when we put forward these kinds of demands on the climate change side, that they'll say, well, the money's gone, right? The cupboard is empty. We've emptied it trying to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. I also think that there's a part of the COVID-19 pandemic that is, I mean, there's so much focus on the response and so much focus on developing vaccines. I'm really deeply concerned that there's not an effort being made to highlight the importance of preventing future pandemics. You know, this particular coronavirus is one of hundreds of thousands of potential viruses that could spill over from wildlife into human beings. And so I think that there's, and then again, that connects to climate change, you know, the integrity of these ecosystems, bringing about an end to deforestation. That's a critical part of preventing future pandemics and addressing the specter of climate change. So I think that there are certainly lessons to be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, but what's critically important is to just get climate change back to the forefront of policymakers so that we can actually start moving forward on the solutions that are so well known and so imperative in terms of their implementation.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Well, we're moving into the final 10 minutes, and so I think let's turn our attention back to COP26 and about what the actions of the UK government should be in terms of loss and damage finance, in terms of facilitating conversations in this area that will lead somewhere, in terms of the ambition that they need to show in order for the COP26 to be the success they want it to be. And I'm sure that they want it to be a success like Paris. And I hope that we all would like to see that happen. But what do they have to do to make that happen, especially in this area of loss and damage? So this is the final question, if you like, allowing you to put your final thoughts together. And so I don't know, does anyone want to offer to go first, or shall I start randomly choosing somebody, or does anyone want to offer to go first on this one?
Well, I'll leave it to the experts to talk about formal outcomes of the actual COP26, but I think there's an opportunity to say here to the United Kingdom, look, and the UK hates to be compared to France, right? I think that's, so say, look, France has been a leader on the solidarity levy. France is a leader on France is the co-chair of the High Ambition Coalition for People and Nature. It's time for the UK to actually take some leadership on one of these international issues. Why doesn't the UK become a champion for one of these innovative financial mechanisms that we've been talking about? Why doesn't the UK say, we're going to impose a tax on air travel tickets issued in the UK, and we're gonna reach out to other countries and bring together a coalition of the willing to create the first loss and damages fund to address this critical part of climate change that people have failed to address for 30 years. I think that would be an amazing leadership thing that the UK government could be persuaded to take an interest in.
Thank you very much for that. Colin, do you have words to follow that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this call for leadership is possibly one that could resonate. We know we've got a government that wants to see COP26 as a diplomatic success, and so leveraging any opportunities for innovative and new ways of delivering that success, I think might be tractable with the COP26 presidency team. I think there's two other things that I think we also need to bring into the mix. I think the first one is, and this is already happening, I think the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, I think they've sent a clear message to the COP26 presidency that if you expect COP26 to be a success, you're going to have to deliver something meaningful on loss and damage. And I think we've seen a shift in the rhetoric, we've seen a shift in the language. Adaptation and resilience is no longer used as a smokescreen to hide loss and damage. So I think the UK negotiators are aware that they need to bring loss and damage out into the open, and they need to be seen to be delivering on it. I do worry, though, that it will be more negotiations, more talk, more guidance, more technical briefings, and not actually what does that mean and how do we operationalize it. But I do think there is an opportunity there, and we do need to apply that pressure to get this gradual process moving. We've got 12 months, and that's a significant challenge. I think the second thing, and the City of London is a massive economic engine for the UK economy and for the global economy. And I think the talk we've had about the climate damages tax and the financial transaction tax and other ways to generate innovative funding for loss and damage are all necessary. But I think we also need to bear in mind that there's the other part of the argument as to why that's a good idea. This isn't just the fact that the City of London or financial transactions are being taxed, but that the money's actually going to help people who potentially could be part and parcel of that global economic system. The people who struggled in the aftermath of Cyclone Idai, the people who are struggling right now in the aftermath of Cyclone Ampan, they're rebuilding their homes, they're rebuilding their livelihoods until the next event happens. And if we were to invest in loss and damage and to invest in prospective risk reduction, a lot of those people would be compensated for the climate disaster and would then have their own assets and resources to invest in economic empowerment, in education, in training. We don't know how many more doctors, nurses, engineers, innovative thinkers there are who are struggling to make ends meet at the moment. And I think unlocking that potential. So this idea of a just transition for people who are irreversibly impacted by climate change. It's not just about people who are economically impacted by climate change. Let's think about people who are physically impacted by climate change and thinking about a just transition for them. And I think the final point that I'd like to highlight is UK government accepting loss and damage as an indicator of success. Increasing loss and damage is clearly an indicator of failure of the global negotiations, a failure of global leadership, and that needs to be accepted. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that, Colin. And I think I will turn to Shikondi next, but I wanted to point up that argument, the economic argument, that it's really short-sighted not to invest in the people who are dealing with loss and damage, because whilst they are rebuilding their homes, which without support could take years, they are not able to fully participate in the economy. And so it's a very short-sighted approach. And I think sometimes that needs to be argued, because that may be the sort of argumentation that is necessary beyond the humanitarian argument or moral argument. It may be that kind of line of reasoning that may be persuasive. Shikondi, your final thoughts.
Thanks. So my final thoughts would be for the COP26, rich countries cannot continue turning a blind eye to the impacts that developing countries are facing right now. Rights of people are being violated due to this blind eye that is given to the issue. There is a food crisis that is in Southern Africa. Women and children are going days without food, and they are still coping the impacts from Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth. So there is also that loss of hope every season, especially with the young people. So for the rich countries and in the negotiation, we need finance for loss and damage, and it is needed now. Rich countries have often ignored and sidelined the very issues of climate impacts and how the global system needs to provide a robust system to help poor communities and countries recover from the impacts of climate change. So yeah, my final word, rich countries provide the public finance as well as penalize those polluting corporations to pay up for the damage that they're causing. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Shikondi, very much. And turning to Zoe for the last word before we close.
Yeah, so kind of on this question, there's a few, small things that would be great to see from the UK government, which I think would have large impacts. Like, for instance, having a youth delegate within the negotiators, or having a more open stance on a conflict of interest policy. I'm unsure if we're going to see those, but those are the things that I think they could do that would, be small for them but have a big impact. But I kind of want to just piggyback off on what Colin was saying, was that, this is a moment we've got to push them on being a strong climate leader. The UK government has had an absolute shocker of a year. They are absolutely failed. Their undeniable flop and mismanagement of COVID-19 is an absolute failure on the global stage. And I think they will be looking to seem strong and like leaders, and try, as Colin said, seem to make a real impact historically and globally. And this government has been flip-flopping so many U-turns, so many inconsistencies, that I think there is a real pressure point for civil society to mobilize and actually make an impact. So I would say, yeah, that would be my goal for the next year, some real strong public mobilization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, there seemed to be very much a consensus around a solidarity facility for loss and damage as something that should have happened yesterday, and certainly should be happening as a goal for COP26, and that the UK has the opportunity to show leadership, to be a climate leader, and a very much sense of building awareness around loss and damage, and that loss and damage indeed does need to be, or loss and damage finance does need to be a metric for the success or failure of COP26.